At my grandmother's 85th birthday dinner, my brother stood up from the table, clinked his fork against his champagne flute, and announced to 47 people that the house my grandmother had left to me in her will, the house I had been renovating with my own money for 2 years, was going to be demolished so he could build a new one for himself and his fiancée. I was sitting 3 chairs away from him. I was the one who had organized this dinner. I was the one who had spent 4 days driving my grandmother to every single one of her doctor's appointments that month because his car was in the shop. I was the one who had held her hand every Tuesday at the dialysis clinic, while he sent me voice memos saying he'd catch up with her soon. He clinked that glass and smiled at her like he was giving her a gift, and my grandmother looked at me with an expression I have never been able to fully describe. Half apology, half something that looked almost like relief, like she finally understood something she had been trying not to see for a very long time. They thought that moment was the end of my claim. They had absolutely no idea what I had already put in place before I ever sat down at that table. But before I get into all of that, and I promise you, what came after is something none of them anticipated, I want to ask you something first. Where in the world are you watching this right now? What city? What time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely read every single one, and knowing you're out there while I'm telling this story gives me something I can't quite put into words. Go ahead and type it. I'll wait. My name is Hazel. I'm 32 years old. I grew up in Kingston, Ontario, and this is the truest, most painful, and ultimately most clarifying thing that has ever happened to me. Growing up, my grandmother's house on Berry Street was the one constant in a childhood that didn't have many of them. My parents split when I was 6. My mother moved to Vancouver and rebuilt her life there, which I understood even then, even at 6 years old, because I was a serious child who was already very good at understanding things I wasn't supposed to have to understand yet. My father stayed in Kingston with my older brother Fletcher and me, but stayed is doing a lot of work in that sentence. He was present in the way that furniture is present, occupying space, mostly immovable, not particularly useful. It was my grandmother, Nettie's mother, Gran Vera, who actually raised us. She made lunches. She drove us to school in her old Buick that smelled like lavender and motor oil. She came to every school play, every science fair, every terrible recorder concert in the gymnasium. She was the one who sat at the kitchen table with me when I was 15 and couldn't stop crying for reasons I couldn't articulate, and she didn't ask me to explain. She just made tea and put her hand over mine and said, "You don't have to know yet." Fletcher was 4 years older than me. He had my father's easy confidence and my grandfather's name, and that combination seemed to give him a passport the rest of us didn't have. Gran Vera adored him loudly and visibly, the way some people love certain things without ever examining why. She bought him a car when he turned 19. She co-signed a lease for his first apartment in Ottawa. When he dropped out of his business program at Carleton after 1 semester, she called it finding himself and quietly paid off the credit card debt he had accumulated in the process. I was at Queen's on a scholarship I had applied for myself, working weekends at a cafe on Princess Street, sending her texts every Sunday night so she wouldn't worry. I don't say any of this with bitterness anymore. I used to. I said it with a lot of bitterness for a very long time, but I've had enough distance now to understand that my grandmother loved both of us, and that the way she loved Fletcher came from a place of fear as much as anything else. Fear of what would happen to him if she stopped catching every fall. What I didn't understand until much later was the cost of that catching. Every dollar she spent landing softly under him was a dollar she didn't have elsewhere. And eventually, those dollars mattered. I graduated from Queen's with a degree in occupational therapy and a student loan I paid off in 3 years. I moved to Toronto, got registered, joined a clinic in the East End that worked primarily with older adults and post-surgical rehab patients. I was good at it. I was promoted to a senior clinician role at 29. I wasn't making extraordinary money, but I was careful with it in the way that people who grew up watching money be a source of chaos tend to be careful, obsessively, almost anxiously careful. I had a savings account, an RRSP, an emergency fund, a line item in my budget for things that broke unexpectedly. Because things always broke unexpectedly. I had built a small, very deliberate life, and it was mine. Then, 3 years before any of this happened, Gran Vera had her first health crisis. A fall in the kitchen that turned out to be a TIA, which turned into a diagnosis, which turned into a conversation about her living situation that my father was entirely absent from, and Fletcher showed up to for approximately 20 minutes before saying he had to get back to Ottawa for work. I was the one who stayed. I was the one who talked to the hospital social worker and the discharge planner and the home care coordinator. I was the one who, 6 months later, was driving back to Kingston every other weekend to check in, to fix the things that were breaking, to sit with her. Gran Vera's house had been in the family for over 40 years, a 3-bedroom Victorian on Berry Street, that she and my grandfather had bought in 1981. for what would now seem like an absurdly small amount of money, and which had appreciated into something worth well over $800,000. She had talked to me about it the previous winter, when I was visiting, and we were sitting in the back garden with our coats on because she liked the cold air. She said she wanted to give me the house, not leave it to me, give it to me now, while she could still see me enjoy it. She said she knew what I had put in. She said she also knew what she had given Fletcher over the years, and that it wasn't equitable, and that she was aware of that, and she was sorry. I told her she didn't have to be sorry. I meant it. We started the paperwork. I hired a real estate lawyer in Kingston. Granvira had her own independent legal counsel as required. I had begun preliminary conversations with a contractor about the renovations because the house needed work. The plumbing in the upstairs bathroom was original. The kitchen hadn't been updated since the 90s, and the back addition had some moisture issues that needed addressing. I had put $34,000 of my own money into those early assessments and a partial bathroom renovation before the formal transfer had finalized, because I trusted the process we had started together. I should say this clearly. Granvira and I had a relationship built on 45 years of her showing up for me. I was not doing any of this to get a house. I renovated that bathroom because I wanted her to be able to stay in her own home, as long as possible. I hired the contractor because the moisture in the back wall was affecting her air quality. I drove to Kingston every other weekend, because she was the person in my life I had known the longest, and I loved her, and she was 85. And I was aware that time was finite. The house was never the point. Fletcher knew about the transfer. He had been told in a family conversation the previous spring that Granvira was planning to transfer the property to me. He had said, and I remember this exactly, "That makes sense. Hazel's the one who's been there." I had thought in that moment that we were going to be fine. I was wrong. 3 months before Granvira's birthday, Fletcher called me. I was at work between patients and I stepped into the hallway to take it. His voice was warm. That's the thing I keep returning to. He sounded like the version of himself I still, even then, wanted to believe in. He said he was thinking about proposing to his girlfriend Simone. He said her family was traditional, and that her parents, who lived in Montreal and were very close with Simone, had certain expectations about stability and home ownership. He said he just needed Granvira to hold off on the formal transfer for 6 more months, just so he had time to figure something out. He wasn't asking for the house, he said. He just needed a little breathing room in how it looked, publicly, for a few months. I said I'd think about it. I didn't say no because I am still, apparently, someone who needed one more lesson in what happens when I say anything other than no. Then my aunt called. Then my father called. Then my father's sister, who I had not spoken to in 4 years, called to remind me how much Granvira had sacrificed for this family. Then my grandmother called, sounding tired and smaller than she had in January, and said she wasn't sure what was happening, but that Fletcher was very upset, and did I know what was going on? I told her it was nothing. I told her not to worry. I did not tell her that her other grandchild had spent 3 weeks running a quiet campaign to destabilize the agreement we had spent 8 months building together. The birthday dinner was held at a restaurant on Ontario Street. A private dining room on the 2nd floor that I had booked and paid the deposit for. 47 people, Granvira's friends, her book club, her neighbors from Barry Street, who had known her for 30 years, my aunt and her family, my father, a few cousins I saw once or twice a year. Fletcher arrives with Simone and her parents, the Peltiers, who were gracious and warm and clearly had no idea what they were about to witness. I had been managing a quiet, low-grade anxiety for the entire 3 weeks since the phone calls started. But I had also, during those 3 weeks, done something I did not tell anyone about. I had met with my lawyer. I had met with Granvira's lawyer, with her explicit and informed consent. I had filed the formal transfer documents and paid the land transfer tax, and registered the change of ownership with the Ontario Land Registry Office. The house on Barry Street had been in my name for 11 days by the time we sat down at that restaurant. I did not make an announcement about this. I ordered the roast chicken, and I listened to my cousin's new baby stories, and I helped Granvira with the clasp on her cardigan when it came loose. I was waiting. Fletcher waited until the dessert course. He stood up, tapped his glass, and delivered what I can only describe as a prepared speech. He talked about family legacy. He talked about how the house on Barry Street had meaning for all of them. He said he and Simone were planning to start a family, and that they wanted to build something lasting for Granvira's great-grandchildren, and that they had been working with an architect, and the plan was to develop the property into something modern and worthy of what Granvira represents. He looked at my grandmother when he said that last part. She looked at me. I kept my face very still. Then he said it was a surprise, and he looked across the table at me with something in his expression that I recognized from childhood. That particular look that said he was certain, absolutely certain, that he had already won. I said quietly, just loud enough for the people near me to hear. Fletcher, the house transferred to my name 11 days ago. The deed is registered with the province. If you've hired an architect, you should probably call them. The table went very quiet. He laughed, not a real laugh. The performing kind, aimed at Simone's father. He said I was confused, that Granvira had changed her mind, that he had spoken to her about it. I looked at Granvira. She looked back at me and said, clearly, in the voice she used when she was finished with a conversation, Hazel is correct. I signed those documents myself. My lawyer was present. I knew exactly what I was signing. The silence that followed that was a different kind of silence. The Pelletiers looked at each other. My aunt put down her fork. My father stared at the tablecloth. Fletcher's face did something I had never seen it do before. He turned to Simone and said in a low, controlled voice that this was a misunderstanding and they would sort it out later. Simone looked at her mother. Her mother looked at her father. Her father looked at Fletcher and said, in French and then immediately in English, so no one missed it. Is this true? Do you announce this without knowing if it was true? I left before the birthday cake. I walked Granvira to my car, drove her home to Berry Street, made her tea, and sat with her until she fell asleep in her chair. When I left, I stood on the front porch for a few minutes in the November cold and just breathed. My phone had 31 unread messages. I turned it face down in my coat pocket and drove back to Toronto. The next 2 weeks were what I can only describe as a sustained campaign. Fletcher called multiple times a day. My father sent long emails that he clearly thought were calm and reasonable, and that were in fact neither. My aunt left a voicemail that I have never fully listened to. The gist, as far as I understood it, was that I had embarrassed the family in front of Simone's parents, that I had humiliated Fletcher at a family event, and that whatever legal technicality I had exploited to steal from my own grandmother would not stand. I want to address that word, because I kept hearing it. Steal. I had spent $34,000 on that house. I had been present at every medical appointment for the last 2 years. I had taken 3 weeks of unpaid leave from my job, the previous spring, when Granvira had pneumonia and needed someone in the house around the clock. I had organized the birthday dinner, at which my brother had stood up and announced plans to demolish a property that had never belonged to him. The word steal was doing a remarkable amount of work. I consulted with my lawyer, who was very calm and very clear. The transfer was legal. The documentation was airtight. Granvira had independent legal advice at every stage. There was no mechanism by which Fletcher could contest this that had any realistic chance of success. But he tried. He filed a challenge with the assistance of a lawyer in Ottawa, alleging undue influence, the claim being that I had somehow pressured Granvira into the transfer. I sat across a boardroom table from that lawyer 4 months later, with my own counsel, and I watched her read the file. I watched her read the record of Granvira's independent legal consultations. I watched her read the statements from Granvira's own lawyer, from her GP, from the social worker at the dialysis clinic, who had assessed her cognitive status 6 weeks before the transfer, and found her fully competent. I watched the lawyer set down the file and say something to Fletcher in a low voice that I couldn't hear. He withdrew the challenge 3 weeks later. In the meantime, I had been quietly, carefully, untangling the ways my family had become dependent on things I provided, without ever fully acknowledging I was providing them. There was a cell phone plan I had been contributing to for my father for 4 years, because his was on a plan attached to mine that I had never gotten around to separating. There was a streaming service subscription and a storage unit in Kingston that I had set up originally for Granvira's furniture, but that Fletcher had been using for his own things for the better part of a year. There was a credit card that had my name on it as an authorized user that I had not opened, and that I discovered through a credit check I ran when all of this started. Had a balance of $11,400. I froze it. I reported it. I removed myself from everything with a 30-day notice, where legally required, and immediately where not. Fletcher had been telling Simone's family that he was a property owner. That had been the entire point of the birthday dinner announcement. To create a version of himself that matched what the Pelletiers expected. When the challenge was withdrawn, when the transfer held, when it became clear that Fletcher did not own, and would not own the house on Berry Street, Simone's parents had a conversation with their daughter that I was not present for and do not know the contents of. What I know is that 6 weeks after the challenge was withdrawn, Fletcher and Simone were no longer engaged. He called me about this. It was a Sunday evening in March. He was crying, and my brother had not cried in front of me since we were children. He said I had taken everything from him. I said, very quietly, that I had taken nothing that was his. I said the transfer had been Granvira's decision, made with full information and independent advice, and that the only thing that had cost him Simone was his own choices. He hung up. 8 months after the birthday dinner, I drove to Kingston on a Saturday morning, with a thermos of coffee, and met my contractor at the house. The upstairs bathroom was finished. The moisture in the back wall had been fully remediated. We were starting on the kitchen. Gran Vera had a key. She came by sometimes in the afternoons and sat in the back garden she had tended for 40 years. And I would find evidence of her visits in the little things she moved and adjusted. A pot shifted to a sunnier windowsill. A hook added to the mudroom wall for coats. She was making it hers in small ways. And I thought that was one of the most quietly beautiful things I had ever seen. I want to ask you something before you go, and I mean it sincerely. When I tell people this story, the part that stops them isn't the birthday dinner. It isn't even the legal challenge. It's the part about my grandmother calling me during the campaign, tired, confused, asking what was happening, and me telling her it was nothing. Some people say I should have told her the truth from the beginning. Some people say I was protecting her. I'm honestly still not sure which one it was. What would you have done? If this story meant something to you, if you have ever been the one who stayed, the one who drove to every appointment, the one who got the call while everyone else was unavailable, please subscribe. I put out a new story every week, and I want you to know something, genuinely. The fact that you are here, listening, means more than I could ever properly explain. Take care of yourself. Hold the people who actually show up.